Now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Sahar Coston-Hardy is a fine art and landscape architecture photographer focused on the social structure of race and cultural identity. Integrating portraiture, urban design, and street photography, her work investigates the relationship between place, power, and personhood. Sahar is a 2020 Women Photograph Nikon Grant recipient for a collaborative project documenting historically significant structures and spaces by examining the landscape of resilience and struggle. A graduate of Tyler School of Art, Sahar is a contributing editor to Landscape Architecture magazine, has lectured widely on urban design photography, and was selected as 2019 Next City Vanguard Fellow in Newark, New Jersey. In addition to photographing built urban design projects, Sahar excels at working with design teams through community engagement from a visual storytelling lens. Alexa Bosse is a registered architect and founding principal of Hinge Collective with master's degrees in both architecture and landscape architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. As a leader of Hinge Collective, Alexa has worked with community organizations, city officials, local business owners, residents, and youth groups to build consensus around the realization of needed safe, quality public space. Alexa has taught graduate and undergraduate level studios with a focus on public interest design at the University of Pennsylvania, Stuart Weitzman School of Design, Drexel University, and Jefferson University. Today, they're presenting their talk titled Democratizing Design Through Photography and Visual Storytelling. Welcome, Sahar and Alexa.
Thank you very much for having us. I am going to start sharing my screen now. So thank you again for the lovely introduction. I'm happy to be here presenting at Lavash with and in conversation with Alexa Bosse. Our session, Democratizing Design Through Photography and Visual Storytelling, really focuses in on and directly designing in community with communities. So I'm going to start the session with examples of my work, and then I'm going to turn it over to Alexa, who's going to talk about Hinge Collectives, storytelling methods, and then we're going to finish the presentation talking about the work that we've done collaboratively. So I am very, very passionate about photography and specifically documenting important and vibrant spaces in the built environment. And I'm often commissioned by landscape architects and designers to do so and document their projects. I'm also a continuing contributor to Landscape Architecture magazine and have been since 2016. And while my commission work is across all scales and typologies, I really am most excited about documenting how people engage with their environment through these types of intimate moments. So in 2019, I worked with Agency to photograph portraits for their Miller Prize project in Columbus, Indiana. XX is the name of the project, and it is a project that really connects and reveals these invisible stories, particularly those stories of Columbus's women. So the XX installation was inspired by the switching operators that once worked within the AT&T facility site, which was the site chosen by the landscape architects and the planners, and by the facility's history of erasures, which were both physical and symbolic, and by Xenia Miller's transformative influence over the city. So here, portraiture was really implemented with the intent of visually highlighting the individual members of the community. So what we did was we incorporated video, we incorporated audio, and photography, still photography, as a method of listening and sharing community voices. And Agency did a great job of weaving in community engagement through every aspect of the project, especially from the beginning. And they often had a prompt that was, tell me about a woman who positively impacted your life. And here was no different. So this is what I did when I signed on to the project. I interviewed people and I asked the people this question, and I'm just going to read one of the community members' responses. Kyle Hendricks, he says, "Deborah Hendricks is my mother by all means, but she's technically my stepmother. She chose to be my mother, and for all intents and purposes, she has been my mother for my entire life. She supported me. She's worked through corporate America to make my sister and myself and my father happy and sustaining in life. Yes, she's my hero." So that was a really beautiful moment just to witness and to be a part of. And I was really happy that he was able to share such a vulnerable moment and story about his life. And so together with Rhiannon Sinclair and the community, I made portraits and interviewed 34 people over 3 days. And it was really, it was an honor and kind of a humbling experience because people really opened up and shared details about the women in their lives that really helped change who they were. And I'm going to play just a quick audio clip. So this is audio with a still portrait, and this was used in the social media campaign for the project.
Sarah has inspired me in a lot of ways, mostly because of her involvement in social justice. She is an advocate for people who don't have the opportunity to voice what's going on. Anybody who's not feeling justice in this world, she is an advocate for them. And that has been so inspirational to me. I want to be like her. Sarah has inspired me in a lot of ways.
Okay. So in the final installation, we actually landed on using the audio only for the outside installation and exhibition. And so the audio, and the reason is because we wanted to be able to organically let the means of the storytelling sharing method kind of define how the exhibition would be finalized. So because the space was very flexible and allowed for the community to kind of design how they would want the space for specific events or just for passive use, we decided that audio would be the best for the final exhibition. And the audio was, we had speakers that were embedded in the planter boxes that you see, and visitors that moved throughout the site could hear the stories as they moved through the space. So, you heard like this cacophony of all of these voices and these stories, and you could stop and you can listen, or you could just kind of move along and hear like bits and pieces of everyone's story. And it was a really beautiful and emotive experience. So in 2013, I started working on Hunts Point Lifelines with Olin and Penn Design. And this was a rebuild by design competition project. And it was a response to the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. And the call was to investigate ways to help at-risk communities and work on a resilient master plan. So I worked alongside a dedicated community engagement consultant that was local to the site, to the South Bronx. And we conducted video interviews together. He asked a lot of the questions. He knew a lot of the people there. We talked to stakeholders, to residents, small business owners. But I also wanted a bit of a deeper exchange with the community. So I also facilitated 2 youth projects. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I wanted to just share one of the examples of the 4 shorts. So it's long, complicated story about the project, but in short, it follows 4 different lifelines. And so I made 4 short videos that concurred with each lifeline. And so with all of the interviews that I collected, I made each of these shorts that were then shared at stakeholder meetings and really helped inform the design. And then later at the very end of the project, all of these 4 videos were edited into a much larger piece. And then we folded in interviews from the designers' perspectives about why they made certain decisions. So this is one of the 4 shorts that I'm going to share with you now. having community input is integral to any design process. There is just an invaluable and often intangible sort of quality to the type of knowledge a local resident or business person or perspective brings to the element of design.
I think they should be all connected and people should walk. It'd be great for the street to be a park. Right. That would help us become a middle class community.
I mean, the average medium income can certainly increase if more residents are working in the industrial zones.
I think a lot of folks want to see economic development come out of this. There are huge opportunities to have economic development, but even to reimagine how that takes place beyond just the actual building of infrastructure, but thinking about what long-term maintenance looks like and who's doing that, and all those questions really have answers that could provide relief to a community that's been underemployed for decades.
Our interest is finding employment for residents of the South Bronx in living wage jobs that pay a solid benefit.
It's good to have your workforce able to live near its jobs. And the only way you can do that is making sure that that workforce is paid an adequate wage to cover the cost of living in the world's most expensive city.
Was fun. It was a time. It was, and I still as it today. Yeah, it was the only affordable neighborhood that I could do my business. This is a very special place to start up a business because you also have access to everywhere and the tri-state area right from here.
One thing I will say about the market that if you come in there and you show your work study, they will like move you up. You know, I know a lot of my friends down there that like porters and that like get like foremen. Some of you yourself.
So I was born and raised in Hunts Point. I started as a porter. Now I'm a foreman. This is one of the best decisions I've made. I love this job, and this is my future. Working at Nitel and Nitel.
So as I said, I also worked with two of the youth that lived in the South Bronx in this Hunts Point community. And it was really The Point, which is an after-school facility and much more than that. They're a really great resource and to the community, and they offer tons of programs to the youth. And they really helped identify people that would be interested in this type of project and that were interested in, video and photography. And so we worked together probably over the course of 6 weeks. And I went to the South Bronx to facilitate their projects, and we wrote outlines together. We created storyboards. And really, I shouldn't say they created storyboards and they wrote the outlines, but I just, helped them along. And we did some research of Black filmmakers that they were interested in. And so they completed these two projects from their own perspectives. They're a little bit long, so I'm not gonna play them, but they were really beautiful, and it was about the challenges and the opportunities in their specific neighborhood that they saw. And so I also joined the design team for Eastern Market 2025 strategy, closer to the middle of the project for this piece. It's also an Olin project. This was in an effort to add more community voices to the project. So I didn't start in the very beginning of the strategy. It was much more towards the middle, almost end, because we were lacking in images, real images of the neighborhood. And there was a lot of robust community engagement, but they wanted something that was a little bit more visual, that they could, put within all of the different documents, and that people could actually see themselves as a part of the project. So I was inspired by really the traditional photo stories, and I decided to take that route and just use photography. And I documented the neighborhood and the character very much in a street photography style, but I also photographed many portraits and interviewed people. And this is one of the stakeholders, and he really helped me, Steve Walker, he helped me find people that were interested in being interviewed. And I started with joining one of the community meetings. And then the goal was to have this like spider web of getting in touch with everybody's internal network. And that kind of happened, but it was also very difficult because I was only there for a short time. So I decided to also make person on the street interviews while I was photographing the character of the market. And that was a really great decision in hindsight, because I met so many more people and so many people that wouldn't have necessarily joined these community meetings. And it was really lovely just to hear, what they had to say and just meet them and talk to them about the market. And so many people just really, especially entrepreneurs, really, the market is the hub, and there are so many different small businesses around the markets and even vendors at the markets and adjacent to the markets. And it's a lifeline for them. So some of the questions that we asked were, what does the Eastern market mean to you? How do you envision the future? What makes the Eastern market unique? And asking these type of questions really got people to open up and give us, some personal stories about the market and some just like how they deeply felt about it. And what the images did, like I said, they really helped populate the strategy document, the final report, the executive summary, of course, in that. But the best, from my perspective, the best part of having all of these images together was that they were printed on these large scale panels, and then on display at the final presentation, which so many of these people came to. So they were really able to like directly understand how, they played a part in the strategy. Oh, and now I'm going to turn it over to Alexa, and she's going to talk about the work at Hinge Collective.
Thank you so much, Sahar. Great. My name is Alexa Bosse, and as was mentioned earlier, I am a licensed architect. I'm also trained in landscape architecture. I'm actually probably more of a landscape architect than I am an architect, but for some reason when I went to school, I was focused on architecture, and all of my professors for the first year were like, so are you really going to be an architect? Because everything you want to do has to do with public space. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania, which offered the dual major. So I picked up landscape architecture and have been acting as a landscape architect ever since. So I founded Hinge Collective in 2007 because of my passion for community engaged design. And so Hinge Collective really has, our mission is to be not only a firm that is doing quality community engaged work, but also our mission is to sort of be part of a movement that begins to highlight the value of community engaged work as the central focus of design moving forward. So I could probably talk about that at length. You could ask me about it in the questions if you want. So our work really centers on the process of design. And we want that process of design to be one that is owned and guided by those that use the space, not by those of us that are coming into the space in order to offer sort of, landscape architects come with a vast set of tools that those people that are using the space might not necessarily have. But I really see our role as using those tools to help translate what they already know and have. So, finding the right process for each community can be a little hard. There's no one size fits all for community engagement. There are a lot of ideas out there, but oftentimes for us, it means trying a whole lot of things at once. We call this throwing all the spaghetti at the wall, but it's not just about throwing the spaghetti, but it's about having a good deal of introspection and self-reflection throughout the entire process. So throwing the spaghetti at the wall, seeing what worked, what didn't, and then deciding what's the next move going to be in order to continue getting the best feedback and the best participation that we can. So there's a few things that we ask ourselves with every project. One, who are the keepers of that space? Right? And are we transparent and accountable to the keepers of that space in respect to decision making? Whether that's decision making for how the design will look, or decision making for how we will engage with community members, or if it's literally comes down to decision making of who's going to be the DJ at the block party, right? So all of those different layers of decision making process, we need to make sure that as the designers and the outsiders, we are transparent and accountable to those. And then also we want to make sure, and this is number three, the most important, is our process reciprocal, right? Are we giving as much or more than we are taking? I would love to have a conversation about this later in this conversation if we have time, but I think it's really important to make sure that community engagement is not just about taking from the community, but a way of being reciprocal. All right, so those images that I showed you earlier were a project in Baltimore where we were looking to design a public space for a community that lived around it. But what I'm going to talk about right now is a project in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia. The reason that I'm talking about this is because that issue of who are the keepers of the space was particularly challenging in this process, and that is why we began to use, or why we use photography in order to find a common ground for that. So this project started as a graduate level studio for the University of Pennsylvania. It was a combined studio with both landscape architecture and planning students that Hinge Collective was running in partnership with community organizations as well. The idea for this studio was to test a practice of incremental placemaking. I'll probably mention incremental placemaking a lot, but it's the notion of testing and finding out what they're getting responses to that, and then adding in order to start to incrementally create a space that it will be held by those that use it. But so the studio was trying to find a way to use design as solutions that could be responsive to how that space was going to be used over time, and then also how it could be edited or expanded in order to meet that particular need over time. So we really had our work cut out for us. I don't know, those of you that are not in Philadelphia or in the region, Kensington has been the center of the opioid crisis in Philly for over 30 years. And there are a lot of reasons for that I don't necessarily need to go into. But just before our studio began, there was a major homeless encampment that had been forcibly cleared out of a rail overpass. And people were forced to take shelter in various vacant lots and other overpasses. So this was the overpass that was there or where people were living was not an ideal scenario, but it was cleared rapidly without really a plan for how to address where those cleared people were going to go. And so our site showed up as the main feature in the New York Times Magazine a month before the studio began with this feature saying the Walmart of heroin. In the next slide, you can see our site, and that underpass right there to the right is where that previous picture was taken. And you can tell that this site is, like many vacant lots, it is completely covered in trash, but it is also, it is being used for folks that were experiencing homelessness. So in this community, the housed and the homeless communities have been at odds for decades. And this space and design within this space really brought that conflict to a head, right? And so this design studio and this design process became the place where that conflict was playing out. So we partnered with a neighborhood organization called the New Kensington Community Development Corporation, who had, decades-long relationships with the residents. They'd been running programs for those experiencing addiction and those experiencing homelessness for years. We spent a lot of time in the neighborhood. So I think even, these are some of our students that were here, but really one of the first steps in sort of in any type of community engagement is becoming embedded in that community. So we were there for cleanups, we were there for the existing scheduled meetings. We sort of made sure that we were participating in all of the conversations that were happening in that neighborhood, not just the ones that affected our design, because this design of the site was not the only thing that people had opinions about in the neighborhood. And it's important to understand how the solutions that we were able to bring were also related to the other things that were happening. So, and there were a lot of people that cared about the space. There were a lot of people that had really strong opinions, and there were a lot of conflicting opinions that people also had in common. So it's an interesting dichotomy. So since these various keepers of the space were not able to come together face to face without conflict, and by conflict I say at many community meetings that I would go to, people were literally throwing things, upturning tables at each other. There was a lot of anger in the community, well-founded anger, and people not feeling like their voices were heard. So we had a series of meetings with different groups of people, but we're not able to bring them all together without just being another place for yelling and screaming. So what we did discover that we could do is that this is what sort of brought us to the Wish Gallery that I'll talk about. There is a local church in the community that was just about half a block from where the site was. It is a church and boxing gym, which I just love as a model, but it's very active, wonderful people. And this church and boxing gym hold a block party every year, where you can see here that it is located underneath the elevated train. The whole commercial corridor along Kensington Ave is. And so this giant block party occurred once a year. It had an enormous turnout. And so we decided to use that moment where lots of people were coming together in order to talk to people that were on that site. So we brought a mobile production studio and we wanted to take pictures of people holding up their wishes, right? The idea behind this is we really wanted to find an opportunity of these people with very different opinions to notice, and this is the question we'd ask throughout the process, like when you begin to dream about what the place could be or what the neighborhood could be, everyone agreed, right? So even though perhaps how you got there was different, there were common goals that everyone agreed upon. And so we wanted this Wish Gallery to begin to demonstrate that all of these different personalities and all of these different interest groups were all really working towards the same common goal. So as a way to bring people together and then allow everyone to see each other a little differently. So we engaged a local photographer for this who actually just lived a few blocks from the site. We brought a generator, we brought a tent, we had a photo printer, and we were taking portraits of folks and printing them and hanging them on the spot. One thing that we also did as well, we printed up these sort of like the larger 8.5 by 11 prints and laminated them to hang them up, was we also printed photos for each of the people that participated. So everyone that left also walked away with their own portrait done by a professional photographer that they could go home with and put on their refrigerator if they wanted. And in fact, it was that leaving with a photograph that began to attract people to our site, which was at the end of the sort of block party. So the block party was several blocks long and we were at the tail end of it. So, but people would show up and be like, I hear you're taking portraits of people that we can take home. And so even that became what we wanted. People brought to us. So as you can see, we printed them, we laminated it. I was actually talking with Sahar earlier. I completely forgot that it rained the first hour that we were there. It turned into a beautiful day, but when we first set up, it poured down rain, and we were there with like our computers and our printers and our generators, but then it stopped, and it was a beautiful day after that. So there are some photos of some of these portraits that people took. It was actually, we have one of a husband and wife, but there were kids came and posed together because they also wanted those pictures of them with their friends. And so the end result was that everyone saw each other sharing the same wishes and the same aspirations. The other end result was also that people walked onto the site. And this might not seem like a really big deal, but if you remember that picture from earlier where it was covered in trash and, you know, needles and other various things, there was not a desire. I think one of the largest things we heard is you can't make this a public space, right? Like no one's going to walk onto it. It's not safe to be there. But after this wish gallery went up, all of the grass in front of it started to wear away. So when we would go back, we would notice that people were walking up and looking at it and having conversations with each other and seeing these. You can, yes, so people, it started to like break down that that sort of fear of being on the site and being able to not only see common inspirations or aspirations, but also see that this space is something that can be inhabited. And then also following this exhibit, I mentioned earlier that there were some people that liked to overturn tables and yell at each other, and these are those two people right here. After this wish gallery, Lisa is on the right, and she lives on the block, and her whole family lives on the block, and is very opinionated about how the space is used. And then on the left, Shaggy is very interested in participating in, making sure that those that are experiencing addiction and homelessness have what they need. And so they have common goals, but they were doing them in very different ways. And after the wish gallery, we did build some planters and spruce up the space and bring in some grass and sort of like we implemented a lot of those design things that we did with the students. And in this build day, at one point we turned around and they were both working on the same planter at the same time. So I felt like that was this moment where we'd like gotten, they were in agreement enough to be in the same space together. And this next picture shows where we built a sign that we sort of worked out what those signs and those rules were going to say with all the different interest groups. And here was us installing that sign. We also, this became a space where Santa came. So the space itself, we actually stumbled upon this sort of like family event with Santa Claus one afternoon when we didn't know it was going to be there. We were walking by the site to check on it, and we got in and got to meet Santa too. So it became a space that was being used, which was lovely. All right, now I'm going to talk about another project called the National Street Service. So we're moving from this sort of like very specific place-based project in Kensington neighborhood to this is a much larger, a broader project where we were really trying to have a conversation with the whole city of Philadelphia. So this project, the National Street Service, was funded by Ford Motor Company as a way to really understand the future of mobility and the future of streets as public space. So the National Street Service was considering streets and sidewalks as the largest area of public space in cities. So it's not about the parks, it's not about the vacant lots, but if you start to look at just the volume of streets and sidewalks in any city, not just Philadelphia, that is a large percentage of the public space, the public right of way. And we really wanted to shift focus to make that feel more like public space, to make it feel like those spaces were for people, not just a viaduct for high-speed travel, right? So the National Street Service hired 30 ambassadors from across the city. And this was a 10-week program. They conducted experiments in the street that we really, challenged them to reframe their idea of the street, as I just mentioned. So much of the project was about documenting these experiments. So everyone had a budget that they were able to use to do the street. It was 30 different ambassadors, so 30 different things happened. I'm demonstrating here where someone made a bench with a shade canopy at a bus stop where she always saw her elderly neighbors waiting for a bus with nowhere to sit down. And she thought this should be a place where a bench should be, even though the city has not provided a bench there. She then added these word games to the fence behind it and came back to notice that people were participating in the word search and other things. So just beginning to, have conversations with people asynchronously. It's the new 2020 word, right? So much of this project was documenting the experiments, providing that space and the budget for people to identify what mattered to them most and then do something about that. We can call this tactical urbanism to this crowd, to the folks that we were working with. That wasn't a word that we had at our disposal. So, and then also photography and video were really key to this as a way to hold these experiments in time, right? Each of these was very temporary, whether it was, 30 different projects, whether it was someone who added a trash can to her block and covered it with flowers and then made a commitment to empty that trash, right? Whether it was someone that did these interactive experiments. We had another ambassador who made a seesaw and got like a little piece of AstroTurf and put the seesaw and the AstroTurf at another bus stop on the street. So everybody was sort of identifying these things that were important to them. And then because we realized this value of being able to hold these moments in time for when those temporary things were no longer there, we brought Sahar and photography with video and storytelling into the project in order to help us capture those.
And so I'm going to show a short clip of one of these experiments. And as Alexa said, I was, brought on towards the end. So some of these installations or these projects were essentially finished when I came onto the project, but I worked with about half of the ambassador cohort to then just talk about their experience with it, and to get an insight into, why they wanted to bring this type of project to the street. And so the value of video here was really to just capture their thought process and their idea of, changing urban and public space.
So for my project, I decided to create a new historical marker to a woman named Mary Miles, who in 1867, at the location that's now 30th Street, refused to move desegregated trolley accommodations. And she brought, in 1867, a case for integration all the way to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And I haven't found any other monuments or memorials or ways of commemorating her. And I thought that her story deserved to be shared at the space that is now 30th Street Station. So I made this marker for her.
So as Alexa said, photography was also implemented here, and I documented. In these images, you'll see that some charter school students who were part of the cohort were painting a chalkboard for their for the final celebration, which culminated in a block party, which we'll talk about in a minute. And this directly was in relationship to their project, which was a community listening box where community members were asked to submit ideas about positively changing elements of their neighborhood, which is kind of, now I'm thinking about it, Alexa, is really an interesting, it's interesting that their project was this community listening box, because we were listening and you were listening to them as a community, and then they kind of like pushed it off or outward, also to their wider community, which I think is really interesting and nice.
Totally.
So if you want to talk about the block party.
So at the end of this 10-week session, there was meant to be a large event that would celebrate everyone finishing. We had no idea what this final thing was going to be when we began. And so it was a part of that 10-week process with the ambassadors to determine what that final celebration would be. And there were several things that came up during the ambassador programs, especially looking around sort of like the public right of way, is that the ambassadors through the process were able to, one, learn a lot more about like who makes decisions about the streets and the sidewalks, right? So it was, one, understanding it as public space, two, understanding how they can sort of speak to that or advocate for certain aspects within that, right? Like if you want that bench to become permanent, who do you have to talk to, right? In order to get all of these bureaucratic processes through. But also there were a lot of resources in the city of Philadelphia that were trying to get people that were doing this already. So really this block party was, one, a celebration, but two, it was also a way to begin to, just like the students were doing, connect their neighbors to everything that they had discovered during this process, whether that was in personal reflection about how they feel about the street, or how they can begin to advocate for certain things. So block parties had food, they had music. We had 3 of them around the city. There were, which was also
at the same time,
3 block parties at the same time, all with food. They were connected. We had like iPads talking to each other, but it was a way to share all of those resources and everything that they knew, and other ways to advocate with other people in their community that weren't part of this process. So, I mean, what you just said, Sahar, about what the students were doing is, yes, we're listening to you, but I think that everyone can say, I'm not necessarily representative of my entire, I can tell you my opinion, but it's not going to be my neighbor's opinion. So really, being able to have ambassadors that don't just speak about their own experience, but are able to reach into that network of community and neighbors and friends that we can't, is a really, really valuable tool that we discovered here. And it was a fun day. And it also rained at first.
I was just about to say that. Anecdotally, it poured. Oh, I should have put those images in here. Poured in the very beginning. But
just for the first hour, and then it turned into a beautiful day.
Beautiful. And so we photographed and documented the block parties, of course, but we also took the opportunity to make portraits of some of the community members that came out. And some there might have been a few, yes, there were a few ambassadors that we photographed, but these are also just people living in the neighborhood that came out to the block party also to eat and to just hang out, listen to music. But then they learned a little bit more about the Ambassador Project. And I'll just show a few more of these images because they're really beautiful and fun.
I will say one of these placemats, or these welcome mats that say "Welcome to the Street." This was one of the ambassadors. What she had done, as her experiment, she did this in chalk at first, but she would, like right outside where you parked your car, she would in chalk write a "Welcome to the Street," trying to acknowledge that when you get out of your car, you are now using the public right of way, right? This transition, but then that. We sort of grew that for this final event, and everyone could come, and we had stencils that people could use to make these. And I still encounter these many years later. I still encounter these in the city. Yeah.
Awesome. So I guess we should talk about some of the key takeaways here too, which were definitely the power of this neighborhood ambassador program. That leveraging agency, and you already mentioned this, but the leveraging the agency of the community members throughout the project is invaluable. And that the events are a strong means of engagement in themselves. And that photography is really just about, is about making place and time.
Yes. All right, and now I'm gonna touch on a project that we're working on together very briefly so that we can have time for questions. But Sahar and I are working together again for the strategic plan for the Philadelphia's trees, so the Philly Tree Plan. Another conversation with the whole city. So we are learning from National Street Service, and we're also going to be working with ambassadors for all the reasons we've already mentioned across the city for this again, as well as a variety of other engagement methods, which I have to share. So we're holding a virtual open house. There is a citywide survey in 9 different languages. There's a photo challenge, which we're going to touch on in a second. An engagement tour where, since things are virtual, we actually have a member of our team that's visiting all of the community organization meetings, most of which are on Zoom at the moment, and presenting this. I think that every night she is presenting for like the next 4 weeks. She's totally booked up. We have a Community Voices Steering Committee, which is made up of both residents and nonprofit community organizations that have been helping us from the very beginning in sort of shaping the engagement around this. Neighborhood ambassadors, which I'll touch on in a second. Stakeholder workshops where we we met with developers, we met with programmer peoples, we met with 7 different groups. And then also there'll be a public comment period. So Philadelphia is, when you look at many maps, there are disparities across cities that later, when you guys can visit the virtual open house, you can really dive into why that is particular, how that works in Philadelphia. But just to touch on it, when you start overlaying physical, mental health, heat vulnerability, these sort of issues that relate to trees, since that's what we're focusing about, they began to form a map, which we have on the next slide, that we're calling the need map, right? So the need map is really helping us identify where trees can do the most good, right? We also use this need map to help us identify where we should select ambassadors from. So with National Street Service, it was an open call for anyone who lived in the city of Philadelphia. But for this one, we are really being very specific about making sure we're talking to people that are in those high need areas. So here are where they are located. We're starting a 6-week program next week that is sort of broken into, that is broken into 3 parts. The first part is going to be looking at interviewing. I mean, we all know that those interview moments and things that people are saying are super valuable, and it's where you can get the most sort of nuanced stories. So it starts with interviewing. But again, the ambassadors will be conducting interviews of their friends and family and neighbors. The next part is adding on to that interviewing with a visual storytelling exercise, where we're just looking at smartphone photography. Everybody can take pictures, so it really makes it possible. But this is where we want to sort of capture the relationship that people have with the trees in their neighborhood, right? The urban forest. And I think a lot of this is, number one, understanding that it's a forest. It's just a forest that exists in the city, right? It's not the forest as we traditionally think about it. But what is the relationship people have with that urban forest, and capturing that visually so that it can be more easily understood by everyone else. And then it ends in an action of some sort. And there's a lot of options for those actions, whether it's, taking more photos, writing postcards about policy. We're sort of going to see, again, like National Street Service, we decided what that final action was. We're going to allow the ambassadors to determine where they want to go with that. So this, actually, Sahar, I'll let you touch on it.
Yeah, so this is one of the photo assignments that we're going to be working on through the visual storytelling component of the Ambassador Project. And I will obviously be leading this. And what we're going to do is we're going to give people some different tips and techniques that they could use to really be able to use their smartphone in a way to capture how, basically Alexa said it well, much better than I'm trying to say it. And they're going to capture how their relationships, how they feel about the urban forest and their relationships with trees. But they're going to use all of these different techniques that are probably new to a lot of them, like using silhouettes, getting details, having changing your point of view. So, most people that are not, graphic, like everybody here is very, image oriented and very, graphic savvy. So I'm sure we all take pretty good photographs, especially with our smartphones. But, most people just kind of like walk up, point and shoot. So it's just getting people to think differently about how they see, and how that kind of how seeing differently can change your experience, but also show and reveal different elements of the environment, especially with other people. So here's just an example of some of the assignments that they'll be doing. And then we're also going to have, well, we already do have, because we started it last week.
This just launched last week. It's officially launching on Tuesday again. But right now, if any of you guys, soft launch, if you guys are passing through Philly, we are doing this citywide photo challenge where we really want people to share their stories about trees. Again, this is trying to capture that conversation about relationships on a larger citywide scale in a way that we hope is very easy for people to participate in, right? Like if you don't want to come and fill out the survey, then tell us how you feel through imagery.
And again, you can use any images that you've taken of trees in Philadelphia.
Yes.
Before, yes. It doesn't have to be current.
But this also allows us to see how other people see the urban forest, right? We are, as you mentioned, Sahar, like most people on our team are very graphic and design focused. So being able to understand what are the other elements that people aren't seeing, or that we aren't seeing, that they bring light to. I think we're going to end it on this so that we can answer a couple of these questions. So thank you all so much. I'm going to answer this first question that I already see in here about de-escalation facilitation training. I have received a good amount of facilitation training. I am not the best at it, and so I don't know if anyone would say that they are an expert on it. I try to make sure that I am not the one that is responsible for facilitating conversations in a community that I am not a part of. So whenever we enter into any type of community process, we make sure that if there are community organizations that are already in that neighborhood that have that relationship, then we make sure that they are also in all of those conversations with us. Because I don't feel, as the designer, that is always my place to hold. For some other projects, we've actually brought in social workers or other people that focus on, issues around people experiencing homelessness or addiction or other issues. So I bring in, I can do it in a pinch, but we always make sure that there is someone on our team that is able to do that. And that's a really important thing. So thanks for asking that question. There's another question about continued relationships. I'll answer that one too. Sahar and I were just talking about it. Again, a great question. I think that one of the biggest problems with design projects and designers doing really good community engagement is that they become the holders of all of that information, right? And then they leave because the project's done. Whether it's a plan, whether it's a design project, no matter what it is, they walk away from that project. This is going to have a really similar answer to my last one, which is I make sure that people that are embedded in communities are there. For this urban forestry project, the Philly Tree Plan that we're doing, we have members from all sort of areas within Philadelphia Parks and Recreation present at all of our meetings. And in fact, they're the ones that are doing this community meeting tour because they, not Hinge Collective and our consultants, but Parks and Rec are going to be the ones that are still there.
I can follow up with that too. So it's a little bit different for me, making relationships with people. One thing that I neglected to mention, and I'm glad that Alexa mentioned this in her wish gallery project, is that I also offer high resolution images to people that I photograph. Generally not printed, because I'm not making the images and printing them directly on the site necessarily, unless, that's part of the project, but I haven't done that. But I usually follow up, even if it's like on the street, photographs and street portraits, even when I'm commissioned to photograph a space, I often run into people that are asking me what I'm doing, and we talk, and sometimes I make portraits of them. I ask, hey, do you want a portrait while I'm here? Because that's another passion of mine, and we exchange numbers, and sometimes we stay in touch. So in the case with the XX Miller Prize, I, had everyone's contact information, gave them their high resolution images. And, a few of us have been in exchange since then. And it's really just kind of up to the connection that you make. And if, this connection may turn into like a long-term friendship. The other day, actually yesterday, I got a text message from a young man that I photographed this summer while I was commissioned to photograph a park. And he said, hey, are you in the neighborhood? Can you take pictures of me tomorrow? And I was like, no, I won't be there, but we can do it next week. So, it's just keeping that that level of exchange open and exchanging your contact.
I know when you were doing portraits at the block parties, the 3 block parties at the same time for National Street Service, there was such amazing reception from all of those groups of people, because it goes back to that, make sure that we are giving more than we are taking, right? And that's, if you can find ways to give people something that is relatively easy for us to give, but just not needing to own it, being able to give it back, then there's a lot of value in that.
Another question we had was, if you had the opportunity to co-teach a design studio together, what strategies of photography, engagement, concept designs would you implement that would be more novel compared to traditional assignments in landscape/photography courses?
Sahar, we should talk about this.
We should. I like this idea a lot. Thank you for giving us this idea. Well, we haven't thought about this before, so I really want to process and think critically about this. I'm going to grab a book while you start talking about this, but I just recently bought a book called Active Landscape Photography, and it's about the use of photography across the spectrum of landscape architecture. And it doesn't dive into portraiture necessarily or community engagement at this point. It's mostly about construction documentation, of course, of the build project, site photos, but it's a really brilliantly written, and I'm only halfway through, but I'm really excited about it, book about photography and how landscape architects should be using it widely and in myriad ways.
I mean, I think if we were teaching a studio, then we have that benefit of folks that are already sort of design oriented when looking at photography. I think that another tool that we use at Hinge is at the events or the engagement events that we host, we take a lot of pictures just so that we can populate our final renderings with those people that are in the neighborhood. I know that, awesome, Sahar. I know that making sure people in the renderings are representative of the community is a hot topic that should be a hot topic that you should all be thinking about. And we, of course, always ask if we can do it and let them know what we're going to be using those photos for. And people will pose for us. We have these, in our Baltimore project, our ambassadors gave us all these funny, sitting on a bench poses and things that we ended up using in our renderings, which were really fun. So. But I don't know, we'll marinate on that.
I think we have just time for one more question. The next question is, are there ever concerns that arrive about privacy, or are people generally receptive of photography in the community? How do you communicate your credibility and the importance of your work?
If someone doesn't want their picture taken, I'm not going to take their picture. Yeah, we've had ambassadors that didn't want their picture taken or their names represented anywhere, and that is never a reason that they cannot be an ambassador with us. We just make sure they're not in any of our photos. So.
And then sometimes, it's important to also have model releases for me for specific projects like the XX Miller Prize project. And did I do that for Detroit? I don't remember if I just asked for verbal, okay and yes in Detroit, because it was so long ago. But for the XX Miller Prize, because I knew that some of these images would be published, I really wanted to make sure that I had that, that okay and that permission from everyone that was involved, especially because some children were photographed. And I mean, just in a general practice, as a photographer, I, of course, will never photograph someone that doesn't want to be photographed explicitly. But, I am making photographs in the public realm, which is fine to do. And I'm perfectly in my right to do it. But depending on the space, I will ask if it's okay, and I will approach specific people and participants of an event or community. Now, when it's like 100 people strong at a concert, which I've done before, that's very difficult. But I'll just share one quick story, and I think we're going over, but someone literally asked me to delete a picture of them before. They didn't want their photo taken. And I was holding the camera up because it was an aerial image of like 100 people. And they said, "Hey, did you take my picture?" And I said, "Yes." And they said they didn't want it. And I deleted it. The end.
Yes.
Thank you so much for an amazing talk, Sahar and Alexa. We'll end here to accommodate the next Zoom sessions. And thank you again, Sahar and Alexa. For everyone attending as well, enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. All right. Bye.